I think they both play they're symbiotic, right? You need history in order to be able to understand certain elements, especially when it comes to the present day. If we've got a virus today, we can look at all the mistakes of the past generations and look at what they did and what they did wrong or what they did right. And then we can transfer that into, I guess, present day and see whether or not that would work, but also come up with new solutions and use our brains more effectively, let's say, and common sense and rationale to move things along a lot better. And we've also got technology now to help us out, or it should be used to help us out, right? I think it's just how we've got to merge them both together and use them both to effectively make a better society and learn. And hopefully we do learn from the past.
Yeah, I mean, there's a human aspect to every science. It's done by humans, and of course the products of science, including the knowledge, are knowledge of humans, products that humans use, people use, right? So it's not like people sometimes think of science as like this, the way that Spock on Star Trek, the Vulcan, emotional. And exactly that guy. But science isn't like that. Like it's not. It's filled with emotion and drama, and its power stems from that. Even on Star Trek, the whole reason why Spock was interesting was that he actually wasn't emotional, right? You could see, he's half human. That's supposed to be a weakness. He considers it a weakness, but it's not a weakness, right? It's his great strength, and what makes him an interesting character. I think science is like that. Like science, there's no like platonic ideal of science outside of how humans use it, how humans engage in it. There's human stories all across it. If you forget that, you're gonna essentially undercut the power of science, or and probably this is even more dangerous, misuse it in ways that harm people.
I want to go back a little bit and ask you, do we know what in history has been the worst ever recorded disease? And then
I'd say smallpox. There's no question. I mean, it's throughout history. I mean, hundreds of millions of people. It wouldn't surprise me to have killed, on the order of hundreds of millions of people. It's gone. It's the only human infectious disease that we've intentionally eradicated.
Wow.
And it took a century for us to do it. It's only recently, like I think 1979 was the last case of smallpox ever recorded on Earth. And it took a century of effort with fantastic vaccine. The man I think most responsible in the 20th century for its eradication is a man named Donald Henderson, who's I think the 20th century's best epidemiologist. And certainly on par with John Snow. As a tremendous figure, a towering figure in epidemiology. He helped organize the world response to smallpox. Basically the tools were vaccinations, but then toward the end, when the outbreaks were happening in places where there wasn't, remote areas of the world where there wasn't vaccination coverage, in the midst of wars, he would try to negotiate with countries to try to get teams sent in. They had a strategy of whenever they would identify a local case, they would fly in, vaccinate the person, all the family members, people, other contacts. They use techniques that actually are pretty effective for smallpox, ring vaccination, but contact tracing, all these tools that are very effective in smallpox. And they even also quarantine, of course, the person who had smallpox, right? It turns out, and so but applied in a focused way on the set of people that were getting smallpox locally, not a global, let's shut down the whole world until smallpox disappears. It's interesting in history to see these themes come up over and over again. Sometimes they're applied wisely, and they result in fantastic outcomes like the eradication of smallpox. And sometimes they, like during COVID, they're not applied so wisely.
Yes. Well, I promise we will get into that, but I wanted to ask you before. I know we keep sort of alluding to the whole COVID thing. We're getting there. How does Christianity, more specifically, or I guess the idea of spirituality, how does that play into epidemiology and science as a whole?
That's a complicated question, Jay. I think I think we live now in an age where that has this false idea that that faith and science are at odds with one another. That if you have faith in that there is a creator God, that automatically makes you unable to reason scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
That idea is ahistorical. In fact, if you look at the Enlightenment, it comes up out of a place where faith is like the it's like water, like it's how everybody thinks and acts, including the most important and prominent scientists of the age. People like Isaac Newton, for instance, he was very much driven by his Christianity. Mm-hmm. Blaise Pascal in France. If you go down through the list of people who sort of made modern science, like the progenitors of modern science, for them, faith was a tremendously important part of it. I mean, and a part of it has to do with, there's a philosophical thing, right? So if I'm to do science, the purpose of science is for me to understand the order of the material universe. Well, how can I have any faith at all that I'm capable of understanding material universe? It's a complicated thing. It's so complicated that maybe it's possible. Maybe no human can understand it. That's one response to this complicated reality we face. It takes faith to say, look, if the universe was created by a creator who has a mind and has an order and isn't trying to trick us, right? That's, for instance, what a Christian might think. Then it's possible for me to apply my reason, who's also created by that same creator, to understand the universe. So faith then plays a symbiotic role with the goal of and the actions of science. Our actions, because we're made by a creator that isn't unreasonable, isn't like trying to trick us, that makes us so that we can also reason. So then that means that we are capable of using methods, scientific methods, to understand what the universe is going to be, or else otherwise just doing science at an impossible task. You need some faith that my actions as a scientist are going to lead to understanding in order to do science at all, I think. And so it's not surprising that the history of science starts in places where this faith is actually, is quite strong.
It's also, for me, when I think about it, trying to understand reason and rationale as a concept. And I'm going, if I'm trying to understand both of those things, where in the world do they come from? How in the world are humans able to reason rationally, for example, with another human being? And when we're talking about science, I think both of them have got to exist. You can't just have science and just say science exists, but reason and rationale does not. So I think.
Really, go ahead.
I was just, yeah, you can go. I think you're going to say something more interesting than me.
I doubt it, Jay, but because you were on a roll. But I got to say, so like one of the things that has always puzzled me about this idea that science and reason, that science and faith were at odds. So for instance, like let's just ask what science is, like the premise of science, right? The premise of science is that when I'm studying a material phenomenon, I'm not allowed, and this is an axiom of science, I'm not allowed to make recourse to non-material phenomena. I can't just say there are like these gremlins pulling down on your shoes and that's why gravity works, or your feet, right? Yeah. That's a non-material phenomenon, unobservable, unfalsifiable. It's not science. And that's an axiom. When I make a scientific claim, I have to start from physical axioms, material axioms, not non-material ones. Okay, well, I think that's reasonable. It's an incredibly powerful technique of understanding the world. It's produced all kinds of leaps in our understanding of how the world, the material world works, and resulted in all kinds of of technologies that we find tremendously useful, couldn't do without. Vaccines among them. But can you use that system then to conclude that there are no such things, that they're only material reality, that there is no non-material reality? Can you, for instance, use it to prove that we have no soul? Well, no, because you started with the axiom that there is only material explanations. That axiom produces science, tremendously useful. Yeah. But if you had a different axiom, you might lead to different conclusions. You can't use that axiomatic system that excludes non-material causes to then conclude that there are no non-material causes. So it's a category error to say that science excludes faith. Science in its own realm is tremendously powerful, but it doesn't say that there are no non-material causes. It assumes that there aren't, but it doesn't. So you can't thereby conclude that there aren't. It's like you're essentially assuming the conclusion when you say that. Whereas so what that means is that I'm not saying you necessarily have to be faithful or believe in a creator, but there isn't anything in science that says there isn't a creator. And conversely, I very strongly believe that faith, properly understood, allows science to exist, because if I have this faith, all scientists have it. Like, all scientists believe that their work is going to produce a better understanding of ordered reality. If they thought reality was so unordered that their work wouldn't produce it, well, then why are they doing science in the first place? Yeah. So that's what I mean by it's a symbiotic relationship, not a antagonistic one, as we've heard, I think, countless times in the recent decades.
Well, I look at it from this point of view as well, just going along with what you were saying, which I think is brilliant. How would you go about proving in a tangible setting a person's soul? How would you showcase that to anyone without the faith element to it, without the belief that this is in fact real? If you're not allowed to question that, which is fundamentally the role of science, to be able to question things and to learn and to figure things out, if you're just going, I'm a scientist, but soul doesn't exist because I don't have tangible proof, then you're not really a scientist, because you've just said that this, in fact, is not actually real, and you haven't dug a little deeper. You haven't asked any further questions. So when I've seen, you've got these evolutionary biologists and, these atheists that come out and say that God doesn't exist because science claims it doesn't exist. We don't have any tangible proof or any evidence. Well, how do you know? Like, what is your reason behind you, in fact, saying that it doesn't exist? It just, to me, that it's not really doing effective science, in my opinion. It's like they're denying real science in that case. That's my viewpoint.
I think that's an interesting idea. So, like, the idea, it reminds me of this principle in science, right? So if you want in science to prove the lack of existence of something, like you want to prove that something doesn't exist, you have a hard time in science, right? It doesn't exist until you identify, until someone finds it, right? You can say, oh, well, my theory implies that this thing doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean how do you know your theory is right? There's not, if the theory is wrong, the thing could exist, right? So, I'll give you examples of this in science. In the science of genetics, genetic crossover, genes that crossover in meiosis. That idea, before it was known, the idea was that you couldn't have, if two Drosophila flies mate, and what they have red and curly wings, and one other has I don't know, black eyes and red eyes and black curly wings, and other eyes has black eyes and straight wings, that they would that their kids would inherit the traits together, or rather independently. And yet often you see traits inherited together, and very rarely you see like crossover events that would then break that bond. It's very famous result in genetics that the very rare crossover event was discovered by a fly that shouldn't have been there if the old theory was right. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at that the non-existence of something, a soul or something, if you have a theory that says that it can't exist, that's not the same thing as proving it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Much easier in science to prove something exists than to prove something doesn't exist. You prove it exists by showing it.
Yeah.
Like here it is. But the question then is like, okay, by an atheist or someone might be to a theist, say, look, prove that a soul exists. But again, so now the question is, how should the proof go about? Right? It's not enough to say that I can't. I'm not allowed to prove. I can't prove that it doesn't exist using scientific methods, because science isn't built for proving non-existence. I want proof before I believe, right? Then I have to say, like, okay, well, now we're not talking about science. Science has as an axiom that there is no non-material causes. A soul is a non-material cause, if there is one, right? And so I'm not going to be able to use scientific proof to prove something that science excludes as an axiom. I'm also not going to be able to use science to prove that it doesn't exist. If a soul exists or doesn't exist, we're going to have to discuss it using other methods.
Which I think that there comes the theological debate, doesn't it? In that instance.
Well, I mean, that's then you have to like say, okay, what do you mean by other methods?
Yeah.
How can I know that there are not some non-material things? I'd say, like, I think we all really know. We all really do know. Like, so why do I love my mother and my father? Why would I sacrifice myself for someone else, even if I don't know them? Why do I give to charity? Why do I act in why does my conscience tell me things that to do things that I think I ought to do, even though it's probably bad for me to do them in some narrow material sense? There are like some deep mysteries, and you can have scientific theories to try to address at least parts of those mysteries, but you can't really get at the full of it. We all know that. So if we all know that, if you know that that's true, that must mean that there are non-material things that we have to reason about, and we may then need different methods and scientific methods to reason about those things.
Do you ever think that even if they were to prove it by science and hold it up tangibly, here is evidence that we've got a soul, do you still think that people would actually believe it or deny it anyway?
I don't think it's possible actually to prove it by science. So I guess I would argue with the premise. I mean, I agree with the atheists in that sense, that you can't actually use science to prove those things. Yeah, that it's a category error. I completely agree with that. And I think, in fact, a lot of people who are faithful have, I think, by trying to use science to prove something that it can't prove, have done harm to the cause of faith.
Yeah,
we've set ourselves on an impossible task. My view is that if you accept what science is, it's beautiful and worthwhile and powerful and in its own right, but it's not everything. And trying to pretend like it's everything is a mistake. At the same time, trying to and that mistake then impoverishes you. Now, atheist friends of mine will say, like, look, that's not true. I'm leading a full, happy life, and I don't disagree with them. They're leading a full, happy life. But I do believe that they are impoverished in ways that they can't recognize. Well, they won't agree with me because they're talking about, I'm talking about things that they don't believe exist. So, it's an impasse.